I will follow Deborah with a hearty good afternoon. And I'm going to go off script for a moment given what we saw yesterday, to issue a quick LLAP to everybody who might have been checking out the last episode of Picard yesterday. Don't worry, I'm not going to make my remarks topical through the series or that last episode, despite the deep temptation I might feel to do so. First, I want to say it's a deep honor to be in this work with Deborah, with my colleagues in VPA, and especially with our treasurer, Alon Holt, with whom I get to work in leading the Institute for Diversity in the Arts. My remarks this afternoon are shaped by that affiliation and through some of the work I do in my own scholarship in this quarter that is playing out in a course called Science, Technology, and Black Vernacular Cultures. The actual title is Funkadelic from a Parliament Funkadelic album, and the rest is the subtitle. And I also want to say, as I get started, that I feel a lot of alignment with our speakers this morning. I so appreciated the presentations that we got to hear, and I might need to riff on some of what I heard from them a little later, but we shall see. Quick note, I'm going to work from prepared text in order to honor our time together. Deborah and Alon and my colleagues know that I'm long-winded, and sometimes I tell my students I can't even clear my throat in 15 to 20 minutes. And so we're going to use text to keep me on point and to respect your time. So given the question that we were asked to address, can technology transform systems of power within culture and its institutions? I want to give two answers. The first is an emphatic absolutely not, maybe even a hell no. Also, shout out to Kijo Lee from Moad in the building. Very glad to see you, friend. Yeah, the first is an emphatic absolutely not. The second is slightly more optimistic, and I hope to sketch some ways that we can gesture toward the transformative. And from there, I want to be able to offer an example or two of the kinds of work I imagine us being able to do with the technologies that we do engage in museums and arts spaces. If you'll allow me a preparatory moment, I'd like to limit out the question and the stakes of the question as I see them. What I really appreciate about our prompt is its clarity about what we ought to be aiming for in our engagements with technologies. That we are not looking simply to extend or improve what we already do, but rather asking those of us in museums and art spaces broadly to make aiming for the transformative central in our imaginings and work for the future. Where I want to enter some caution and even be honest about the reservations I have is about claims that our technologies can, will, or should be transformative. What do I mean here? As you could probably tell from my salt and pepper, and if I had kept my beard, you'd be able to tell that the salt is clearly winning. I, like many of you, I imagine at least, are living lives that bridge analog pre-internet experience and the current era of the last 30 years or so since the GUI or the graphical user interface helped to make the internet and digital lives in general so ubiquitous, even inescapable. And for those of you who, like me, bridged those eras, you remember the grandiloquent claims that were being made in the early days of the internet and the World Wide Web. We heard regularly that the internet was going to transform societies, equalize power relations, and every institution that we can think of. We imagined that if we could only close digital divides, all the rest of our divides would quickly and easily follow. 30 years later, or a little bit more than 25 years since the phrase digital divide became common parlance, power relations in this society, and we've heard others say a lot of compelling things about the global climate, have become even more unequal, even more concentrated in the hands of a few, just as wealth has. In the US, we have seen very little from major tech companies in the way of dedication to build with communities of color and other marginalized groups, and almost nothing in the way of using the potential of digital technologies to address the depths of racism, sexism, homophobia, or to explicitly work toward ending the deep disparities that remain. Unfortunately, more often than not, the people who do manage to get hired within those companies to raise hard questions about these issues sometimes end up being fired, as we know of some recent examples. We have seen precious little investment of venture capital in projects founded and led by people of color, Black people and Black women in particular. Some of our largest technology companies, especially in the social media landscape, have chosen to build their products to foment hatred and enable its spread at incredible speed and scale, rather than limit it and challenge it, because the worst impulses in us garner clicks and attention, and because the attention economy is good for some folks' other economies. And we have seen almost no willingness to tackle problems related to the longstanding inequities from the perspective of those who are impacted. So given that history, it is clear to me that in the balance between helping to equalize power relations or even ameliorate hatred and systemic marginalization affecting so many groups on one hand, and intensifying the benefits enjoyed by those who already benefit from the ways power operates in the society and globally, those who design, build, deploy, and sell so many digital and internet-related technologies have chosen the latter to such a degree that I worry deeply about our collective health and futures. To enter a little bit of the tragicomic from the Picard reference earlier, sometimes it seems that what we've created, especially here in Silicon Valley and in our society more broadly, is akin to the Borg, where the choices are either to assimilate or to be annihilated. And even though I'm being somewhat playful in the tragicomic, I really do worry that that's where we are. And I worry that in the choices we make with technologies that we help to reinscribe those very difficult problems. But, as the prompt suggests, we have the chance to think about these issues differently in the ways that museums and arts organizations and spaces can use technologies, and in the ways that those who work in museum spaces, all the way from front of the house staff to their boards, have a chance to counter these deeply entrenched patterns and maybe somewhat shift how we collectively understand our multiple histories, our multiple presents, and multiple futures. Where's Seb? Really appreciated that phrasing earlier. But I said I wanted to parse the question a little bit, so let me return to that, to the main thread. The layers I want to have on all of our minds from the prompt that we've gathered to address are: 1, transformative toward what ends? 2, transformative for whom? 3, transformative in whose interests? I believe that in the arts generally, and in imagining what museums can be and do for cultures and the communities they serve, that we actually can employ technologies in ways that gesture toward the transformative if we use them to dramatically rethink audience and purpose. The TLDR, too long didn't read version of my point that you might have discerned from my use of the phrase dramatically rethink is that the most innovative, high-powered technological tools and systems, even if we can afford them, even if we're using them thoughtfully and skillfully, will do nothing towards the question if they're deployed only or mostly toward the presentation side of what we do, or toward the visitor and member experience with our arts organizations and museums in their current instantiations, missions, and exhibiting practices. And that's even allowing for the fact that several of our organizations, including Stanford University, have attempted some reckoning with these questions post-2020. Where our hope for the transformative lies is in our willingness to rethink questions of whom we want to serve and what relationships we hope to have with the audiences we serve. Audiences, our relationships to them, relationships to both collections and processes, need to be re-examined, in my view, continually re-examined, and the hope lies in bringing work toward transformation on those questions to bear on how we examine and engage with technologies. So if we're willing to take those questions, transformative toward what ends, and transformative for whom and in whose interest, seriously, then we might make some progress. And for me, that progress means that we're working not simply to extend and increase access. That's important work. But a couple of decades ago, in the midst of the very present nature of digital divide discourse, I tried to attempt a sort of taxonomy of access, even toward the transformative. And I worked from the concept that at that time I called meaningful access. And at that time, I suggested that meaningful access to technologies, but I'm also going to insert museums, arts organizations, to collections, to meaning making, and then also the technologies that we use, critique, and resist, includes not merely physical access, be it in the buildings or the virtual spaces or both, but functional access, or the literacies that our speakers this morning mentioned, experiential access, or not just having experiences connected to these spaces or connected to technologies, but experiences that are meaningful for the people in those local communities that we often cite. And then finally, critical access. In the context of technologies, what I asserted a couple of decades ago is that any formulation of access that does not also include building healthy, robust, critical access means that we're simply handing our money over to large companies. And so in the context of what we do in arts work and museums work and archives work and preservation work, we've got to cultivate relationships where people are willing to clap back and really question what we're doing, and we have to be prepared to take those questions in that critique seriously. We want to promote an approach to accessing our spaces and the technologies we employ to include our use of those spaces and technologies, but also building literacies, experiences that are meaningful, and the ability to engage in critical dialogue on the terms of those with whom we hope to connect. In the context of art spaces and museums more broadly, to me that means, and it's difficult because we're all deeply trained in what we do. We have expertise, we move with authority. But that means rooting our work in co-inquiry, co-creation, co-curation, and collaborative meaning making. And we heard an example of collaborative interpretation in meaning making as we heard about really important work in India. Or to put it a different way, seeing our audiences not as groups of people we serve in only an invitational one-way relationship because of that deep knowledge and expertise, but as true collaborators who, again, in that vernacular sense, also have important knowledge to bring to what we do and how and why, and to which technologies we ought to be using, should use, or should not use. We can deploy the technologies we engage toward those ends, not only increasing direct physical access to our exhibits, collections, archives, and activities, but inviting our friends, our collaborators, to mix and mixtape, rework and remix contents, collections, and our larger understandings of purpose. To put it differently, we want to not only use technologies to increase that physical access or that direct access to the stories that we curate and tell, but we want to nurture storytellers and technology users to tell their own stories through and beyond those that we curate. The way I put it in a different context is that we want to encourage and nurture digital griots. And I was so grateful for the reference to griots earlier. If we truly open up our work, then our ideas about who belongs in our work and on our staffs, again, from the front of the house to boards of directors and trustees, and if opening our sense of audience takes the needs, the aspirations, the stories, the worldviews of those we often only consider for outreach or an occasional diversity exhibit, then we can reach toward transformation. Let me prepare to close. In my tradition, folks got to let you know 2 or 3 times that they're closing. Let me prepare to close with 2 examples of what I mean. One from an arts leader I've known all my adult life, and one from a museum leader whose work I saw from the beginning when I served as the Langston Hughes Professor of English at the University of Kansas some years ago. The first example I think we can learn a great deal from is in the work of someone who is currently a visiting artist for IDA this year, Daniel Gray Cantor. In the time that he spent, Kijo knows about Daniel, in the time he spent as the founder and executive director of 12 Literary Arts in Cleveland, he built a community-based program working with teens and young adults as readers, writers, storytellers, and thinkers. Yes, he had 12 and 13 and 15 and 18 and 22-year-olds engaging with Bell Hooks and James Baldwin and Toni Cade Bambara out of school and on their own time, and had them writing and speaking and developing their own voices, had them engaged in critical dialogue about issues they cared about in their neighborhoods, schools, and the larger city. But he did something even bigger than that I believe bears on our conversation today. Over time, he built an approach, I even want to say a model, for civic participation that truly equipped people in local communities for that work. Now, I'm going to go even further to say that he built an approach, this is my claim, not his, that he built an approach to true participatory design applied to civic engagement and connection with arts organizations. I watched him work to build capacity in young people and adults whom many local leaders would have had no idea how to engage or even connect with. The second example I want to lift up is the work of Dr. Doretha Williams, who for the last 7 years has been the director of the Center for Digitization and Curation of African American History at the Smithsonian Institution. And the purpose of the center is, in their words, to use, quote, innovative technology to preserve and share African American history and culture. In her leadership of the center, Dr. Williams has built the kind of approach to audience and purpose that I've been describing earlier, and used those core commitments to drive not only how the center employs technologies, but how the center itself runs. One example of that work is in the center's community curation program. And they describe it as, quote, a digital-first initiative bridging the generational digital divide. And I love the use of the word generational in that. And so given the conversation we're having today, what I appreciate most about the work that Dr. Williams and the center staff are doing is, one, they get out of the buildings, as you've heard people talk about earlier, and engage people in local communities directly in decisions, not just in doing some of this for themselves, but in decisions about what can and should be preserved and shared. Builds capacity and the layered kinds of access to both technologies and archives that I've been advocating. And they view their audiences as true collaborators, not just in engaging the materials that the Smithsonian has, not just in telling their own stories, but also in the broader work of the center. The members of the center staff don't simply invite people to the museum or go out, but they get out of the building and they include people in their expanded sense of audience and purpose, invoking and involving them directly in the big picture conversations, the macro level conversations about preservation and curation methods and interpreting and meaning making, all while collectively doing preservation and curation. So given all that, this time I actually want to close with what might seem to be a basic, even trite observation that you've already heard from other people. Human needs, commitments, and decisions need to drive our technology decisions. As trite as that might be, that's sometimes hard to hold on to when we're forced to think about, okay, how do I keep up with these changes here? How do I make sure I'm on top of these techniques? How do I make sure that our museum or our center is at the front of what is possible? And while those who design, build, and sell technologies in the digital era have done very little to even contemplate transforming systems of power within culture and its institutions, bringing transformative aims to the technologies we use, particularly those of how we understand audience and purpose, they have a chance to help us bend that long arc of the moral universe that we hear so much about, at least slightly, in the direction of justice. In that spirit, let me end with not my words, but some words from science, technology, and society scholar Ron Eglash. in his introduction to Appropriating Technology, Vernacular Science and Social Power. I'm quoting him here. We need not just more cultural expertise in technical matters, but more syncretism in both directions. We need not only more scientific access for local communities, but more cultural workers, artists, writers, activists, and others who can animate the spirit of technoscience and speak to the soul of appropriated technologies. I'm glad that I felt so much alignment in the room when I listened to this morning's presenters and when I heard some of the reactions in the room, that we have some collaborators willing to not just take technologies as they're given to us, but appropriate and reappropriate them in the interests of justice here and globally, and people able to animate the spirit of the technologies that we use, critique, and resist, dare I say in a different way than I think Professor Eglash meant it, with some soul. Thank you.